No, fine-tuning is not evidence for the multiverse. That is what we're talking about today. And I've got a special guest with me, Dr. Philip Goff on the channel. This is his first time here. And we're actually going to run through a presentation. That's what you're going to see today on the channel, is a presentation that Dr. Goff has put together on this topic of whether or not the fine-tuning of the universe is evidence for a multiverse, which is a really interesting topic if you're into apologetics or philosophy of religion. There's an argument for the existence of God that's typically used. It's called the fine-tuning argument. It's an argument from design of the universe, from these physical constants and other quantities of the universe, the quantities of the beginning of the universe, the initial items. Anyways, there's this argument for the existence of God from fine-tuning. Super, super interesting argument. I've done a whole lot of work on this subject with Luke Barnes. If you don't know who he is, go check him out. There's tons of videos with him on the channel as well. Evidence for fine-tuning. But today what we're going to do, something a little bit different, is we're going to look at the data of fine-tuning, the fact that there is a life-permitting universe. And some people, some physicists, some atheists, some skeptics, it doesn't just have to be that group of people that draw this kind of inference, but there is an inference that's made nevertheless from the data of fine-tuning to a multiverse, that there is not just this universe, there's other universes that are perhaps beyond, empirically undetectable. I'm sure that we'll get into definitions and all that, because there's different types of multiverses that you could postulate and everything. So in any case, it's great to have you here, Dr. Goff. What actually, Josh Rasmussen is the one who put us in touch with each other. And so that was like, anyone he recommends, like, I don't care, I'm going to have him on the channel. So I'm really stoked to have this conversation with you. There's one thing in particular I can't wait to talk about from the slides that you sent me. So I'm so looking forward to this interview, but it's great to have you here.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Cameron. I'm really glad to be on. I've watched some of your episodes, some really good philosophical discussions. So I'm glad to be here.
Awesome. So tell me about, where are you from? Your accent obviously is not American at all. Are you from, well, it sounds like England somewhere, but what part of England?
Yeah. I've got a soft Liverpool accent, actually. I was from Liverpool originally. Some English people can't tell where I'm from. If you listen to the Beatles, when the accent was a bit softer, it's maybe a little bit like that. But I live in Durham, in the cold north of England. I teach at Durham University, so I've been here a few years. Quite settled here now.
I was going to mention that you're kind of like the consciousness guy, and you're a philosopher over at Durham University, and also some of your focused research is on how to integrate consciousness into a scientific worldview. And then I was looking on your website, and you actually say there that, like, one of the other things that you do is you spend way too much time arguing on Twitter.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, consciousness is, I guess, my first love and my main thing. I'm interested in the deep puzzle of how we make sense of how consciousness fits into our standard scientific theory of reality. I guess I spend most of my time arguing against the standard materialist option, and I defend a wacky sounding view called panpsychism, which is sort of consciousness is a fundamental and ubiquitous feature of the universe. And I have a book, Galileo's Error, where I defend that. But yeah, I'm interested in questions about the nature of reality in general. As you say, I get sucked in too easily to arguments on Twitter. People might Twitter, people are interested. Philip_Goff, Philip with one L and Goff for Goff. But yeah, I got interested in fine-tuning, actually, just teaching philosophy of religion at Durham. I teach second year philosophy of religion, and just teaching the fine-tuning and thinking, wow, there's something here. And in particular, this argument we're discussing today, I was like, why is this huge public interest in fine-tuning, and nobody seems to know about this argument? And so, yeah.
I'm super excited. Why don't we get into, well, before we do that, before we get into the presentation, which, let me just give you kind of rundown, if you're going to watch this whole video, what you can expect. We're going to do a presentation. It's going to last around 30 minutes. I'm guessing, is that what you would estimate, around 30 minutes or so?
Yes. I don't want to go on too long. Yeah, but yeah, about that.
Okay, so presentation followed by maybe just some chit chat between the two of us, and then we're going to do some Q&A. So total runtime is going to be around 90 minutes. But before we get into the presentation, I had a quote that I found from you that I wanted to get your thoughts on. And it comes from your interview that you did on the Joe Rogan podcast, which, congratulations on getting on his show. That's crazy. But here's the quote, okay? So it's a really spicy quote. You say, quote, people like Sean Carroll, for example, think, oh, materialism has to be true. Just look at how well physical science is done. It's explained so much. Surely it's going to explain consciousness. And then you say, the irony is it's done so well precisely because it was designed to exclude consciousness. So I just wanted you to, before we get into the presentation, I wanted you to kind of expand on that, if you will.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Sean Carroll's someone I've had lots of really, really good, positive interactions with, even though we totally disagree. He kindly wrote an essay in response to my book, Galileo's Error, and then I wrote a counter response. And so, I think he's a really good, philosophically clued up physicist. And but yeah, I mean, this is basically the central theme of my book, Galileo's Error. I think what drives people to think materialism about consciousness must be true is they think, oh my God, look at the great success of physical science and explaining more and more of the universe. Of course, it's one day going to explain consciousness. But as I studied the history of science and the philosophical foundations of the scientific revolution, the irony I realized was that actually the reason physical science has been so successful is that the father of modern science, Galileo, designed it to exclude consciousness. So he wanted a totally mathematical, purely quantitative science. And he appreciated, I mean, let's just give the short story. He appreciated we can't capture the qualities we encounter in our experience, the redness of a red experience, the smell of coffee, the taste of mint. You can't capture those qualities in the purely quantitative mathematical language of physical science. So he said, look, if we want a mathematical science, we need to take consciousness outside of the domain of what he called natural philosophy, what we now call physical science. Since then, it's gone really well. And we're now in a period of history where people think, oh my God, it's gone so well. Incredible technology. That's the whole story. I think if Galileo were to time travel to the present day and hear about this problem of explaining consciousness in the terms of physical science, he'd say, of course you can't do that. I designed physical science to exclude consciousness. That's the whole point. Anyway, so it's a kind of alternative twist on, which I think a more accurate representation of the history of science, why it's done so well, and what that teaches us, and the lesson we should learn from it.
Yeah, so I think we'll get deeper into these issues as the presentation actually goes on as well. So why don't we just go ahead and start that? I'll go ahead and pull it up on my side. I know that while you have the presentation up, you're not able to see us talking back and forth. So again, apologies about that, but that's just one of the limitations of technology. It is what it is. So, but everyone on YouTube, though, they're able to see you and me at the same time, as well as the presentation. Here we go. So whenever you're ready, just go ahead and start, and I'll interject only if I have a question of clarifying or if I need help understanding some point, but otherwise I will try to do my best to remain quiet.
Brilliant. Thanks, Cameron. Okay, so as you say, my topic today is something I'm sure will be familiar to many of your viewers or listeners: the fine-tuning of the laws of physics for life. This surprising discovery of the last few decades that for life to be physically possible, certain of the constants in basic physics, like the cosmological constant or the mass of electrons, had to have values falling in a certain very narrow range. And many people infer from that it looks like it's incredibly improbable that a universe like ours would be compatible with the existence of life. And yet, against those incredible odds, it is. Somehow we won the cosmic lottery. Some people, as you say, want to say, well, this is evidence for that the universe was designed, a sort of simple Bayesian calculation. If the universe was designed, it's not incredibly unlikely you'd get the right numbers for life. If the universe wasn't designed, it looks to be astronomically improbable that those numbers would just come up by chance. So there's a kind of Bayesian inference to design there. But other people, many scientists, many philosophers, want to take this to be evidence for a multiverse. So the simple idea is if there are a large, enormous number of universes, between them exemplifying a wide range of values in their parameters, then it's statistically likely, perhaps inevitable, that there will be a universe fine-tuned for life. So what I'm interested in is what's known as the inverse gambler's fallacy charge. This is an argument that the inference from fine-tuning to the multiverse is an instance of fallacious reasoning. It commits this particular fallacy called the inverse gambler's fallacy. So this was, first identified in 1987 by Ian Hacking. A much more developed version of it was published by Roger White in the year 2000. This was the first article was in Mind, the philosophical journal. The second one in Noose, huge journals. And so this is decades ago. There's philosophical debate about it. If you go to the Stanford Encyclopedia entry on fine tuning, you'll see a section on this. But what I was amazed at was just that nobody knows about this outside of academic philosophy, despite huge interest among theists wanting to prove the existence of God, or scientists wanting to prove the multiverse, or just feeling that there is a case for that. And so I was actually pleased that I managed to get an article on this published in Scientific American. I had to kind of argue a bit for that. I'm just really passionate about getting this out to a broader audience, because I think it's a really important argument. It's kind of puts philosophers to shame, really, that that this just hasn't been out to a broader audience. Okay, but what I want to talk to you about for today is, well, I've got a new argument, my version of how to press this inverse gambler's fallacy, which I'm put in a book I'm currently working on, which is a chapter on fine tuning. So actually, this is the first time I'm talking about this specific argument. So maybe we'll find out there are some problems with it. I don't know, but I hope in any case it will get people that the idea of the more general charge here of the inverse gambler's fallacy, whether or not my specific way of pressing it works. Okay, so I've got the argument up here. It won't make a lot of sense just on this slide, but hopefully the whole thing will become clearer on subsequent slides as I explain the premises. Okay, so I'll just read it out. In premise 1, the inference from fine-tuning to a multiverse does not commit the inverse gambler's fallacy, IGF, only if the presence of the selection effect plays a role in ensuring that it does not commit the inverse gambler's fallacy, in contrast to similar inferences. Premise 2, it's not the case that the selection effect plays a role in ensuring that the inference from fine-tuning to a multiverse does not commit the inverse gambler's fallacy. Therefore, the inference from, a little bit of a typo there, from fine-tuning to a multiverse commits the inverse gambler's fallacy and therefore is fallacious. Okay, so that's the general structure of the argument. So I think all of this will become a lot clearer when I explain the premises. So I'm looking down at my screen, not always at the camera. Okay, so premise 1. So the basic idea here, forget everything I've said so far. The basic idea here is, in general, I think we all think it's not okay to come across an improbable event and infer a multiverse, right? So the example I like to give, I'm walking through a park and I come across a monkey typing on a typewriter. I look over the monkey's shoulder and it's typing perfect English. It's just finished typing Hamlet, right? You think something odd here. Something's going on here. Maybe it's a robot. Maybe it's a specially trained monkey. Maybe it's a rigged typewriter or something. Now, here's what it would not be good to infer, right? It wouldn't be good to infer to say, oh, well, there must be a huge multiverse, because if there's a big enough multiverse with, enough variety in it, then there's going to be countless monkeys typing on typewriters somewhere in the multiverse. And if there's enough of them, then statistically, there's going to be some of them that end up typing out Hamlet, right? If the universe is just huge enough, maybe it's infinite. Right, so it's not surprising that there's a monkey typing Hamlet, right? I take it we would not think that was a good inference. Okay, so in general, it is not okay. So why is it not okay? So Ian Hacking and White later identified this as an instance of the inverse gambler's fallacy. So let me just say a little bit about that. So the people might be more familiar with the regular gambler's fallacy, whereby you've had a really bad run of luck at the casino. You're not all night. You've been trying to roll a double six. You haven't got there, and you think, I'll have one more go at rolling a double six, and you think, I'm bound to get a double six this time, because it'd be really unlikely to be rolling badly all night, right? I'm owed some luck. Now that's a well-recognized fallacy, because for any individual roll of 2 dice, the odds of getting a double six is the same, i.e. 1 in 36. So for your next roll, the odds of getting a double six are the same, 1 in 36. No matter whether you've been playing all night, whether it's your first roll is irrelevant, right? So that's a fallacy to think, oh, I've been playing all night, so I'm going to have a good roll now. That's the regular gambler's fallacy. Now, the inverse gambler's fallacy, you walk into you're a person who walks into a casino and sees somebody else playing, and you see them have a really good roll. That's the first thing you see when you walk in a casino. Maybe they roll a double six, maybe they roll 5 sixes. And then you think, wow, they must have been playing all night, because it's really improbable if they just rolled once that they'd get a double six or 5 sixes or whatever. But if they've been playing all night, maybe it's less improbable. So they must have been playing all night. And that's also a fallacy for pretty much the same reason, right? Because all you've witnessed is this one roll, and the odds of that roll, let's say it's 2 dice, because my mathematics is not very sophisticated. The odds of that roll getting a double six is the same, 1 in 36. If they've been playing all night or they've just started is irrelevant. So that's the inverse gambler's fallacy. And the thought is that's what will be going on in the monkey case, right? I've just seen this one monkey typing English. That's my evidence that this monkey is typing English. No matter how many other monkeys there are in the multiverse, it has no bearing on how likely it is that this monkey will be typing English. And then the thought is the charge of hacking and white is that this is the fallacy. Looks like this on the face of it, like a similar fallacy is going on in the fine-tuning case, right? We observe, oh my God, our universe is fine-tuned, really improbable. So there must be loads of other universes with less improbable numbers, right? It's the same kind of fallacy. So White defined it as inferring from an improbable event to the existence of many more similar events, less improbable, which are less improbable, right? So, the fine-tuning is improbable. So you infer, there must be loads of other events, less improbable. Okay, so the thought is, so the starting point premise here is, we all agree that in general, that's a fallacy, right? In that monkey case I just described, it will be a fallacy. So what do multiverse theorists say? Well, what they standardly say is that what's different in the multiverse case is the presence of the selection effect, also known as the weak anthropic principle. So the idea that we could not have observed a non-life-sustaining universe, right? Obviously, if our universe wasn't life-sustaining, we wouldn't be around to observe it, a familiar point. So that does seem to certainly marks a difference with the monkey case I just described, right? You could have observed a monkey not typing English, just typing random nonsense. You couldn't have observed a universe that wasn't life-sustaining. So there is that difference, and what the multiverse people arguing from fine-tuning to multiverse say that's why in the case of the fine-tuning inference from the fine-tuning to the multiverse, that's what makes the difference. That's why you're not committing the inverse gambler's fallacy in this case. So that's premise one. If the multiverse theorist is right that there isn't a fallacy here, it's because of the presence of the selection effect. Okay, and then we move to my next premise, which is to say the selection effect doesn't make the difference they think it does. Right? That's the structure of the argument. Premise one, if this inference is okay, it's because of the presence of the selection effect, but the selection effect doesn't make the difference they think it does. So premise two, it's not the case that the selection effect plays a role in ensuring that the inference from the fine-tuning to a multiverse does not commit the inverse gambler's fallacy, in contrast to similar inferences like the casino case, like the monkey case. And I've got 3 lines of support here. First support, I just think there's no good theoretical account of why it should make a difference. Now, what multiverse theorists standardly say at this point is the presence of the selection effect means we don't have to explain why we are in a fine-tuned universe, because in some sense we couldn't have been in any other universe. You look back on your Richard Dawkins in The God Delusion, he says that, but something like that. But that's what everybody says. And that seems to make some kind of sense. But the great thing about having a Bayes theorem available is we don't have to trade in our intuitions of what seems to make sense, right? We can look at the question is, how does this change the Bayesian calculation? And I've never seen a satisfying account of why it would make a difference to the Bayesian calculation, right? The Bayesian inference. So I just don't think there's a good theoretical account. Secondly, and this is kind of connected, it's certainly not making the difference that selection effects standardly do. So I want to give a good example I got from Nick Bostrom of from the election between FDR and Alf Langdon in the 1930s. So before the election, the Reader's Digest, was the Reader's Digest? I think it was the Reader's Digest, doesn't matter. Apparently did a survey, and a poll, a survey, and that delivered the result that there was huge support for Alf Langdon. He was going to win a landslide. Of course, he didn't. FDR did. So what went wrong there? Well, what went wrong was they conducted the poll by telephone. And at this time, only wealthier Americans had a telephone, right? So really, they weren't hearing about the country; they were hearing about what wealthy Americans think. So this is a very nice example of why a selection effect is important. I think when a selection effect, in general, when a selection effect makes a difference to Bayesian calculations, it's because our initial take on the probabilistic connections, the evidence, on the probabilistic relationships the evidence stands in, our initial take on that, when we don't take into account the selection effect, proves to be incorrect, is revealed to be incorrect when we do take into account the selection effect. So in the FDR case, before we take into account the selection effect, so a selection effect, I should say, I haven't really defined, is when the way we're measuring something limits us to consideration of a subset of the population we're interested in. So really, this survey was interested in, what the American public think, but because they did it by telephone, that limited them to finding out what the wealthy Americans think. Right. So before we take into account the selection effect, it looks like what we have is evidence that would be really improbable unless Alf Langdon was on his way to election victory. Once we take into account the selection effect, we say, no, actually, what we have is evidence that would be really improbable if Alf Langdon was not popular among the wealthy, right? So we correct our previous take on it. Now come to the fine-tuning case, right? Before we take into account the selection effect, what strikes us about fine-tuning is that it looks like it's really improbable that you'd get those numbers consistent with life just by chance, right? Maybe you think it's more likely by design or something. Teleology, I'll get to what I think of this stuff towards the end, at the very end. But the point is, you think if this is really improbable if the numbers are just there by chance. Then you take into account the selection effect. We couldn't have existed in a non-fine-tuned universe. Nothing changes. It's still really unlikely that you get those numbers by chance. It's just irrelevant. It just makes no difference. Right. So I think certainly it's not doing what selection effects standardly do. And my third line of support is an argument from analogy. I think when we take analogies and we build in an artificial selection effect, we see it just doesn't make a difference. So here's my wonderful analogies. Let's see what people think of this. The Jane analogy, right? So Jane, this is my mention. Jane was conceived through IVF, and she finds out as a grown woman that the doctor who fertilized the egg that became the embryo that became her was having a nervous breakdown, and so the doctor rolled dice to see whether she was going to fertilize the egg. She was only going to fertilize the egg if it was double six, or maybe if it was 5 6s, if you want to make it more improbable. Right. But fortunately, the right numbers came up and she fertilized the egg and Jane came into existence. And I want to say as part of the story that Jane knows that the doctor subsequently had therapy and that doctor only did it that once. Right. Now, so there's a sort of selection effect here, right? Because Jane couldn't have found out about a roll that wasn't a double six, right? Because if it wasn't a double six, the doctor wouldn't have fertilized the egg. Jane wouldn't have existed. So it had to be a double six. So there's a sort of so just as we couldn't have observed a non-fine-tuned universe, Jane couldn't have found out that it was not the case that a double six, that some other number than the double six was rolled. So here's the question. Does Jane have evidence for what I'm going to call the many doctors hypothesis? That there are many IVF doctors rolling dice to decide whether to fertilize eggs? I want to say obviously not, right? All she has evidence about is that her conception was brought about in this way by this doctor rolling dice. That whether or not there are other doctors rolling dice to decide whether to fertilize eggs has absolutely no bearing on that. It doesn't make her evidence about her conception any more likely, right? So I want to say, similarly, the selection effect in the case fine-tuned doesn't make a difference, right? Our evidence is that our universe is fine-tuned. No matter how many other universes there are, it has no bearing on that. Now, when I've discussed this on social media, including with renowned philosopher of physics Tim Maudlin, who I'm a huge fan of, but I find very, very, very aggressive in discussing. I was like, oh my God, he hates me. But people say he's always like that. But anyway, he's a great philosopher. But what he and many others have wanted to say is, well, what Jane could have evidence for is that that her doctor rolled many times to decide whether to go ahead with her conception. I've had this quite a few times, right? Now, if it was, say, indeterminate how many times her doctor had rolled dice to see whether to fertilize the egg, then I agree she would indeed have evidence that the doctor had rolled the dice many times, because that would make her conception more likely, which is her evidence that her conception came about. But that's not analogous to the real world fine-tuning case, right? That would be analogous to a universe where a situation where our universe had many shots at being fine-tuned. And let's say there's the guardian of the galaxy was waiting to see if it got fine-tuned and then giving it the go-ahead to continue, right? And that's a kind of weird design hypothesis, right? That's not the standard design. The standard multiverse hypothesis is that our universe just had one shot of fine-tuning it, of getting, the numbers fine-tuned or otherwise, but there are all these other universes that also had a shot, right? So I think the correct Jane analogy is the one I gave. She knows that her doctor had, rolled dice just the once, just like our universe had one shot at getting its constants fixed. We'll talk more about the standard multiverse hypothesis in a moment. And I think, when you reflect on that, it's just obvious. Maybe people want to disagree, but I think it's obvious that Jane wouldn't have evidence for the many doctors hypothesis, and therefore, from the fine-tuning by analogy, we don't have reason to postulate a multiverse. There's just no evidence at all. Okay, now, so I think, however, there is a grain of truth in the multiverse argument, right? There's something here that seems to make sense to people. People. Hey, hello.
Yeah. Hey, is it possible to go back to? Yeah, is it possible to go back to the previous slide? Really quickly.
Mm-hmm.
I had a quick question.
Yeah, that one.
Yeah, this one here. So you're saying that Jane has no evidence for many doctors doing it, right? So my question is, how does she actually, in the very beginning of this analogy, how does she get the information that the IVF doctor rolled dice in the first place? Is it through testimony, or is it like through some kind of paper trail? This to me, this is like.
Go on.
I was just going to say, this seems to me to be relevant to what hypothesis she's going to entertain later on. If it's through testimony.
It's an interesting question. It hadn't occurred to me that would make a difference, and maybe it will. And I'd be interested to know your thoughts about why that would perhaps make a difference. I guess I was imagining some kind of testimony. Maybe the doctor, publishes a memoir about a huge regret on this or something. I think in cases, we could just, I don't see why, well, maybe this is probably a more substantive point. I don't see why we couldn't just say, in a Bayesian calculation, you can just say what the evidence is. I think we could just build it in that she just know that's just part of the evidence and see what we could infer from that. But anyway,
no, I don't think it's, no? Regardless of how she actually gets the information, I don't know that it's going to support the many doctors hypothesis. I don't know that just on the basis of having testimony, that's going to suggest that many doctors were involved here. I think that at most it would suggest that she was lying, maybe. Like that's maybe a hypothesis that would be under consideration, that the doctor was lying to her about having rolled all these dice.
Yeah.
So that may be a hypothesis that she would need to entertain. Yeah, that's the only thing that I think would be the result of.
I think where you're pushing with that might be like, that direction might be the equivalent of the design hypothesis, right? That it's some kind of in a way, it wasn't just chance. It wasn't like this improbable event. There's some explanation of it.
Hmm.
But I don't think this line of questioning would. I mean, what we're exploring is whether this gives us evidence for the multiverse. And
Right.
I don't think it would make a difference there.
Yeah, no, I agree. I agree.
Right.
I was just
Cool.
kind of curious
Okay.
how that played in. So that answers my question.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I guess I was imagining she just sort of really knows that this did happen. But if there's less certainty about that, then maybe she'd have reason to think there was some kind of trick or something, and that might be similar to thinking, a kind of design hypothesis that it's not chance. As I say, I'll get on to what I think the fine tuning does show at the end.
Yeah.
Which, yeah, okay. So I think there is a grain of truth in the multiverse argument. People aren't just believing this for no reason, and I think that is that if we had independent evidence that we were in a multiverse of the right kind, then the fine-tuning argument for design or teleology would be undermined, right? So if we just knew, had overwhelming scientific evidence independent of fine-tuning, crucially, that we were in this huge multiverse and most of the universes were not fine-tuned, and a very, very, very small number, including our own, were, then I think that would undermine the argument for design. But that's just, why would it undermine the argument for design? Because it looks, if we knew that, then it would just look like our universe was fine-tuned by chance, right? Because there's all these universes, the vast majority of them are not fine-tuned. The small percentage are. It looks like, it's just some kind of chance thing here, and we're in the lucky group. So that would be strong evidence that it was chance, and therefore, that it wasn't designed. But that's a very different evidential situation. That's where our evidence, our starting point, is the multiverse. That's very, very different from starting with one universe and trying to infer a multiverse. I think that's where the fallacy comes in. Okay, but now you might think, well, don't we have evidence? So that what they get right is, if we did have independent scientific evidence of multiverse, that would undermine the fine-tuning argument for design. But then you might say, well, don't we have fine-tuned independent evidence for a multiverse? And I want to say yes and no. So this is the kind of the final thing I'll talk about. Okay, so there's three things with regards to the scientific evidence for multiverse. There are three
Before
things
you get
we need
into
to
that,
distinguish here.
Philip, can I
Mm.
have you hold up your mug? I really am curious what your mug says. Is it a
Batman.
Marvel mug? Oh, Batman. Okay.
Batman. No, DC.
Batman. You're DC. Okay. All right. I was just curious. I didn't know what it was. I couldn't. You were flashing it too quickly.
Right. Well,
Yeah,
I like
awesome.
Spider-Man
Okay,
as well, actually, but
Spider-Man is the man.
Batman.
All right. Sorry, I won't.
I think
Cut you off again.
Spider-Man's a nice middle way between Batman and Superman, I think, really. Like, Superman's too powerful. Batman's not powerful enough. Spider-Man is, some powers, but not ridiculous. And also, it's like, there's a little bit of tragedy, but, not as much tragedy as Batman. I think it's a nice middle way between. Anyway, this is not part of the presentation.
No, it's not.
Right. Okay, inflation. Okay, so the basic thing here, the starting point is inflation. This is just the thesis that the universe began with a very rapid period of exponential expansion and then slowed down. Very, very quick, very, very brief period. Many prominent physicists like Alan Guth here think there's empirical evidence for this in that it renders more probable many otherwise surprising features of our universe, like that it's pretty flat and that the cosmic microwave radiation is evenly distributed. I mean, this is stuff above my pay grade, but that's what they tell us. Okay, but that in itself doesn't give us any kind of multiverse, right? That's just one universe with a fast start. So where we get the multiverse is the move to eternal inflation, right? Which is that the hypothesis that inflation never ends. There's this kind of mega universe, and inflation never ends in that universe, but various regions of the mega universe slow down to form what are sometimes called bubble universes. And then the thought is, we're one of these bubble universes. You got this mega universe and these bubble universes within it, and we're one of them. So that's a kind of multiverse hypothesis. Why do we go from inflation to eternal inflation? Well, many prominent physicists, like including Alan Guth, think that when you try to model inflation, eternal versions just look more probable, more plausible than non-eternal versions. And as I understand it, I'm not a physicist. The basic idea is, nobody knows what caused inflation if it happened, but they speculate. There must have been some kind of field, and it must have been a field that decayed very quickly because it was over very quickly. Okay, but then the thought is, well, even though the field decays very quickly, because it's exponential growth, there's always going to be more inflating space produced by inflation than there is regions of space where the field has decayed and inflation has stopped. And so inflation's going to go on forever because there's just be always more space produced than there is space where inflation has ended. Okay, so you get internal inflation. Okay, so then you've got a kind of multiverse, but that's still not something that's going to deal with fine tuning because we still don't have any reason to think these different bubble universes have different local physics, like gravity's stronger in one, the electrons are lighter in one, or whatever. That's what you need to deal with fine tuning. But so far, it could be just that all the bubbles that have the same local physics, they're all fine tuned, right? That wouldn't get rid of the problem. So this is where people bring in string theory. Even more speculative, right? There's no, as I understand it, empirical support for string theory, but people take it seriously because it's seen to be one really plausible way of bringing together general relativity and quantum mechanics. This idea that there's, at the fundamental level, there are these vibrating strings vibrating in 10 or 11, I can't remember now, high dimensional shapes. And the reason we only experience 3 dimensions is because the other dimensions are curled up, whatever that means. I'm not a physicist. Now, so when this was first developed, people thought they'd work out, they hoped that they'd work out the mathematics and there'd just be one way of doing it, one kind of high dimensional shape for the strings to vibrate in, and it would just be the physics of our universe. And it would be, wow, that's got to be the truth. Sadly, there were a huge number of ways of working this out, corresponding to different local physics, in gravity being stronger or weaker, cosmological constant being stronger, weaker. And many physicists give the number of 10 to the 500, this huge number, and this is known as the string landscape. Okay, so at first people are kind of disappointed by this, but then thinking about the fine tuning, thinking about inflation, people think, well, maybe there's a way of dealing with fine tuning here, right? There's if maybe different possibilities of the string landscape are realized across the inflationary multiverse. So each of the 10 to the 500 options from the string landscape is realized in some bubble universe. And then, so we're going to have at least one that's fine-tuned, right? So I call this landscape eternal inflation. Now, whenever I read about this, I'm confined to reading popular physics, but whenever I read about this from Max Tegmark or whoever, or Brian Greene, you never get an explanation of why you would think that was the case. Specifically that different possibilities in the string landscape are realized in these different universes. But so, as I say, as we've already said, I had shown Carol on I should give a quick plug for my podcast, Mind Chat, and we had shown Carol on, and we had a 20-minute discussion on fine tuning, and he said actually one reason you might think quantum tunneling might give you a reason to think in an eternal inflation model, given enough time, quantum tunneling would eventually realize all these different possibilities. So I guess perhaps there are speculative theoretical reasons for going for this landscape eternal inflation. Okay, so bringing this all together, there's Brian Greene, who also defends this stuff. I'll try to bring things to a close soon. Oh, we're all right. It's about half an hour, isn't it? So really, there's at best only empirical evidence for inflation, and I think even inflation is a little bit less popular than it used to be. But anyway, that's what the empirical evidence is for. The move to eternal inflation and then to landscape eternal inflation are justified on theoretical grounds rather than sort of direct empirical support. Now, I'm a philosopher, and so I'm happy with theories being supported by kind of theoretical reasoning rather than, direct evidence. But this is a crucial point. If the selection effect makes no difference, as I've argued is the case, it doesn't. Our evidence is that this universe is fine-tuned. That's how we should construe our evidence. Remember, come back to the monkey case, right? It would be fallacious to come across your monkey typing English and to infer from that, oh, well, my evidence is that a monkey is typing English, and therefore infer there's the many monkeys hypothesis. No, your evidence, you should take your evidence as this monkey is typing English. That is your evidence. And this is a very difficult problem in Bayesian probability theory, how we should construe our evidence. But you can't just construe your evidence however you want. It is the case actually that the fact that this monkey is typing English logically entails that a monkey is typing English, but it would be impermissible, fallacious, I think everyone agrees that, to take your evidence to be a monkey is typing English. Now, if the selection effect doesn't make a difference, and so the fine-tuning case is exactly the same, then it's likewise fallacious to take the evidence to be our universe is fine-tuned. We should take our evidence to be this universe is fine-tuned. But it is incredibly unlikely that this universe is fine-tuned on landscape eternal inflation, right? On landscape eternal inflation, as they describe it, there are these random processes that fix the local physics in the different bubbles, and very few, an incredibly small number of them are fine-tuned. It's really improbable. So on that very theory, it is incredibly improbable that that this universe will be fine-tuned, and that is our evidence. And so our evidence massively disconfirms landscape eternal inflation. Sorry. So even if there are some theoretical reasons to take it seriously, our evidence massively disconfirms it. Okay, so you might think, well, who am I to argue with these physicists? I'm not a physicist. I'm not arguing with the physics, right? The point is what they think, and Alan Guth is really nicely clear about this. He thinks, what we should judge a multiverse hypothesis on is our universe likely in the set of universes with observers? And even there's some problems, Boltzmann brains, I'm sure you know about. But that's just fallacious appeal to the selection effect. The selection effect, as I've already arguing, doesn't make any difference. So he cannot do that. He has to say, how likely does the multiverse hypothesis make the evidence that this universe is fine-tuned? Because that is the only permissible way to take our evidence. And clearly, it makes it massively improbable, and so our evidence disconfirms it in a straightforward Bayesian way. So look, I mean, there is a possibility that there is a multiverse, and that's why we have fine-tuning, but our evidence hugely disconfirms that. All right, very nearly finished. I'm just going to be 2 more minutes, and I just want to say, where I go from here, right? So perhaps many of your viewers will have been liking what I've said so far, but they're probably going to dislike me now because I think atheism, which I define as disbelief in any kind of cosmic design or teleology, is massively disconfirmed because of fine-tuning. But I also, and various sort of philosophical reasons, I also think suffering massively disconfirms the omnigod hypothesis, right? The familiar problem of evil. So my money is actually on something in between the omnigod hypothesis and atheism. And this current book I'm working on is exploring arguing on the basis of fine-tuning that atheism is false, arguing on the basis of the problem of evil, omnigod theism is false, and just an exploration of views in between. So I'll just read these out. So one option is natural teleology, defended by Thomas Nagel in 2012. There's a much younger picture of him. Laws with kind of goals built into them. You could have a sort of brute fact view that the constants have the values they do because they are life-sustaining, but there's no deeper explanation of that fact. John Leslie has defended that. Non-standard designer, a god who doesn't care about us. Tim Mulligan's defended. The simulation hypothesis. Nick Bostrom, David Chalmers in his new book, Reality Plus. A god of limited power. Maybe there's a god who wants to create a perfect universe, but they just can't create Adam from scratch by breathing into the clay, as we find in the literal construction of Genesis. Or maybe they can only create from a singularity. So the only way they can create intelligent life is creating a universe that will eventually evolve intelligent life. And there's loads of suffering on the way and they regret that, but that's all they can do. Some Christians have defended a God of limited powers. Thomas Ord, I don't know if it's Ord or Ord. And it's actually made me a lot more open to the truth of Christianity. Actually, I'm very firmly against the omni-God, but these non-standard interpretations of Christianity, where there's, for example, a God of limited powers, I think have changed me from a sort of disbeliever in Christianity to a sort of agnostic, actually. I have disagreements with Urd's particular way of working this out, but I think I'd like to write a paper on this at some point. I'm rambling slightly. Also, process theology has a sort of God of limited powers. And finally, a view I've explored, cosmopsychism, that the universe is a conscious mind that fine-tuned itself. I've got a popular article with Aeon on that if people are interested, and an academic version. Did the universe design itself? Okay, but that's my own view, that both theism and atheism are implausible, and we should be these massively underexplored middle way options. But okay, that's the end. Thank you.
Yeah, I really enjoyed that. And I was mentioning in the live chat just now that if you have a question or an objection to the presentation that was just offered, then now is the time to put it into the live chat. So if you have a question or an objection, I've already got one queued up, and so we're going to get to it in just a second after I ask a couple questions to Dr. Goff here on the end of the presentation. This is what I wanted to talk to you about so much, is that you say that you're kind of in the middle between atheism and then the omni-God, or like, I'll just call it perfect being theism. Okay, so you're somewhere right now and you're just kind of in the middle. So my question is, do you have like a specific hypothesis that you're currently entertaining, or is it still just kind of somewhere in the middle? Or do you have like, God has X amount of power, X amount of knowledge, amount of...
I certainly think none of these stands out massively over the others. I think like maybe the brute fact view is the most parsimonious, but then something closer to theism is less parsimonious, but gives us a bit more explanatory depth to the theory. So maybe there's a kind of balance there. I like the cosmopsychist view. People might be interested. I debated that kind of cosmopsychist view with Josh Rasmussen. That's how we got in touch with each other on Christian Idealism podcast. So I like that view. I'm open to God of limited powers. I think it is a pretty plausible hypothesis, actually. Just the people are just so it's kind of political, isn't it? People, but if I just think you just look at the suffering, you look at the fine tuning. It looks like, I think the world looks like a mix between accident and design. It looks like there's something going on here, but it's not perfectly realized. And I mean, I guess you could put it down to the fall or something, but I guess I don't particularly find that plausible myself. So yeah, cosmopsychism, God of limited powers, I guess that's something in that area feels to me, or the natural teleology. I don't know. I basically think we should take all of these options seriously.
So do you think that power would be doing more of the work here, or goodness? Like, it seems to me that you would want to postulate a hypothesis where the limit is on goodness as opposed to on power.
So that's another option. And yeah, I was talking about this, came up in the Josh Rasmussen thing. So that's another option to say God is, that is an option to say God is not morally perfect. I agree with Richard Swinburne, actually, that to some extent, I think if you go that route, what you're going to have to do is you're going to have a God with a quite complicated psychology. It can't be an evil God, because you'd have a problem of the good. Why is it so much good? So you have to postulate some kind of psychology. Maybe they're running experiments and they're kind of morally indifferent. That's quite a complex psychology. Whereas I think actually a perfectly good God, but with slightly limited powers, that they can only create from a singularity. They can only create a universe with a certain form in its physics, basically the form you get if you take out physics and take out the numbers. I think that's quite a simple hypothesis. I agree with Swinburne, actually, that the omni-God is attractive because in some sense it's a very simple hypothesis, and so in some sense it's a default view. But of course, he gives the speed of light analogy. He says, before we had evidence to the contrary, we assumed the speed of light was infinite, and then we get evidence to the contrary. So I guess I think, yeah, okay, in some sense, maybe the omni-God is the default option, but then we look at the evidence, and I think we should then move to a slightly less simple, but still pretty simple option of maybe a god of limited powers. And then maybe if we take that to be the cosmopsychist option, I think that's more parsimonious still. I mean, we'd have to get into all the details of how that works, but yeah, that's how I think about it.
Okay, yeah, because I was gonna say, and you've undercut the objection that I was about to give you. So I like that. The objection I was about to give you is that on your hypothesis, if the hypothesis was that God is less than perfectly good, then the question arises, well, how are you going to explain the data in the first place? How are you going to explain fine tuning? How are you going to explain the problem of evil? Because I don't think that you're going to really expect either of those on a non-perfect God hypothesis. So, but you don't do that. You go the limited power route, which is interesting. So that would then lead to some, go ahead.
I do take seriously something like the simulation hypothesis that maybe there's a god who's just I mean, not really a god, just some ordinary person who's wanting to run simulations to sort of work out what a universe would look like, and is just amoral, doesn't really care. And in David Chalmers' new book Reality Plus, aimed at a general audience, he said that they would in a sense be a kind of god. But well, I'm kind of skeptical that simulated creatures would be conscious. That's a big debate. But also, I just think it's complicated. It's going to be somewhat complicated psychology of the designer, whereas a slight departure from the omnigod to just limit powers in a way you can, not in a really complicated ad hoc way, but it's just can only create from a singularity, physics with a certain form. I think that's still a pretty simple hypothesis.
All right, let's do some questions. Okay, so let's move to we got one really, really early on. Okay, so I've been wanting to get to this one for a while, but here it is from writer John Buck. Whoa, that is way too big on the screen. Let me see if I can reformat this really quickly. I don't know what's going on. That is so big. Maybe it's because there's so much writing. All right, here we go. Let's see if this is... I don't know what's happening. There we go. All right. So would a form of cosmopsychism, which says the universe fine-tunes itself for life, comes in conflict with the hypothesis of indifference, since fundamental reality has intentional states regarding the existence of sentient life?
So what's the hypothesis of indifference here? I mean, I know that the principle of indifference in probabilistic reasoning. Is this something different? The hypothesis of indifference?
The hypothesis of indifference is a hypothesis that I think Paul Draper developed, and it's basically just that the fundamental reality is morally indifferent.
Yeah, it certainly would. Yeah, it would be. I think the fine tuning. I think the way I open my chapter on fine tuning, the way I think about things, I would like to talk about the history. I think for about 100 years, there was no empirical evidence for anything like design or teleology or anything like that, and that set up this cultural mindset that's been ruled out. God's dead, and I think you can really see that if you look into the history. Then from the 70s onwards, you start to get this fine tuning evidence. We ought to just look at that dispassionately and turn to taking design or teleology seriously, but human beings don't work like that. People are really, you get in a cultural mindset. When the economist Keynes, people said, you didn't used to think this, and he said, when the facts change, I change my mind. But it's very difficult for human beings to do. So I basically think people are in denial about the fine tuning, and it does give us very strong evidence, not necessarily for the traditional God, as I say, but for some kind of value orientation, some kind of the way I tend to put it is some kind of goal-directed activity in the early universe. And the Enlightenment goal is to follow the evidence where it leads. And I just, I think we look back at people in the 16th century, denying the evidence of that the sun is in the center of the solar system, and we think, oh, those stupid people stuck in that religious ideology. But I think, there's a certain kind of, there's always an ideology, and there's a certain kind of scientific ideology that this is how science is supposed to look. And when evidence comes up to the contrary, people are just, I just think people don't want to deal with it. They can't, and people don't really know about it. I mean, you don't get it talked whenever I talk to just friends who are not really interested in philosophy. They've never heard of this fine-tuning stuff. It's never on popular. You should have popular science shows talking about the evidence, saying some people think this is evidence for design, but you just people don't really know about it. So I think there's a cultural problem. So yeah, I do think the principle of indifference is false because of fine-tuning. Sorry, that was a bit long-winded.
No worries. I'm enjoying every second of this interview. So okay, here is a question. I'm still trying to work on the format. I don't know what's going on here. This might be better. Okay, there we go. All right, Maverick Christian, thanks for the super chat, Maverick. He says, what academic papers, if any, are there on this content against the selection effect factor for the multiverse?
Is this person asking for evidence to the contrary to what I've been arguing today? I'm not. Well, in either case, anyway. No. If you look at no, for what I'm
in
saying.
favor of it, yeah.
I mean, so right. So the classic article is Roger White, even though Ian Hacking did it first. Ian Hacking actually just applied it to multiverse models where you have number of universes in time in sequential order, like a kind of big bang, big crunch thing. But then Roger White applied it more generally. And so that's the classic. It's in Noose from the year 2000. I can't remember the exact title, just fine-tuning in the multiverse. And, and then there's you might want to look at my Scientific American article, if I can plug that. Is our improbable universe evidence is our improbable existence evidence for a multiverse or something, as a more accessible intro? But I think maybe part of the reason this hasn't got out to a broader audience is it's just in these dense Bayesian articles. Roger White is a fantastic philosopher. He's also got a great article on I would really recommend is research on the origins of life based on a mistake. But it's very inaccessible for people who don't have an academic background. This is part of, sorry, not mean to plug my own work in, but part of what I'm trying to do with this new book is to get these arguments out to a broader audience. I mean, yeah. I would recommend going to the Stanford Encyclopedia entry on fine tuning, which is the standard philosophy resource online, the Stanford Encyclopedia entry, and looking at there's a section on the inverse gambler's fallacy. So taking it from there. Oh, I've got an academic paper as yet unpublished on this topic on my website as well, philipgoffphilosophy.com, if people are interested in that.
And I've got that linked in the description of the video as well.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, all right. So this was just a funny comment from Meow Meow Meow. 1, if a perfectly good designer wouldn't allow cats to exist, or no, not if, but a perfectly good designer wouldn't allow cats to exist. 2, cats exist. 3, therefore a perfectly good designer does not exist.
Well, maybe the perfectly good designer was limited in her abilities, and so she wanted to create immortal feline creatures rather than these mortal cats that fall apart. But she just sadly wasn't able to do that. So that might. Or
maybe she really wanted to make cats that acted like dogs, but she couldn't.
That's a more plausible hypothesis, actually. Thank you, Cameron.
Yeah. All right, from Parker's Pensies. Have you been on with Parker, by the way?
I'm gonna be. I'm booked in. I think I postponed it because I'm trying to write this book, which is a bit embarrassing because I've come on this. But yeah, we're gonna have a chat. I've enjoyed some of his conversations. Cadagentive panpsychism. So, are you reading this out?
Let me read it out. Yeah, sorry. So,
I'm stealing your job.
Can agentive cosmopsychism make sense of the laws of logic the way that your universal consciousness does? Might be a more fundamental phenomena to account for than fine-tuning laws.
Wow. Okay, done your homework. So I've written this article. I mean, even more speculative article about could we kind of ground the laws of the necessity of the law of non-contradiction in a sort of Hindu mysticism style universal consciousness. So yeah, I mean, look, philosophers explore views; they don't necessarily subscribe to them. Yeah, I mean, I'm interpreting this as saying, yeah, could we kind of combine these options? I mean, I was actually going to write this book on sort of just defending a single position, like a conscious universe, and maybe thinking, could it have all these applications like fine-tuning, the laws of logic, and so on. I changed my mind. I thought it might be too similar to my last book, and I'm instead doing what I said earlier. Yeah, I mean, that sounds like an interesting project. I think I'm going off, to be honest, going off that view. I think I'm inclined to just the view that laws of logic and mathematics are kind of brute, fundamental, ungrounded truths. I'm less up for truth maker theory, if you know about that. So, but just kind of are fundamental truths in their own right, but we don't need to think of them as kind of grounded in stuff. They're just kind of brute truths. And so I think for that reason, I'm less into that universal consciousness view I entertained, which someone has just written a response to recently, actually, but I haven't got around to reading yet. I should do.
All right, so here's a comment, and this wasn't necessarily posed as a question, but I'd like to get your thoughts on it either way. He says, Tommy S. says, it seems like, with the exception of IGF, the inverse gambler's fallacy, every sense in which fine-tuning fails to be evidence for the multiverse also explains why it fails to be evidence for theism.
That's interesting, yeah. So I haven't... That's a possibility, and I know Graham Oppy does argue that, actually. He I mean, in my article, I somewhat respond to Oppy's arguments. People might be interested in, and have a long footnote on it's a very long, complicated chapter. But part of what he says is, even if the inverse gambler's fallacy does work, it also rules out theism, the argument for design. I just don't see that. To be fair, it's a while since I've looked at that bit of Oppy, so I can't remember exactly how he argues that. I just don't see that at all. And I'd like, well, maybe Tommy S could say more, but as I say, the reason the whole thing is that it's a fallacy to infer from an improbable event to other similar events that are less improbable. And that's not what's going on in the design hypothesis. So I don't see why it would carry over.
All right. We had another super chat. Yeah, no, I'm here. I was actually, my iPad sitting on my desk started going off and making noise, so I had to mute it really quickly and figure out what was going on. All right, so sorry about that, but here's Maverick Christian, another super chat. He says, Jane and the dice is a brilliant analogy. I might use a modified version using the lottery to strengthen the similarity.
Great, thanks. I'm glad you like that. Spread the word, or if you have a different version. I mean, why I came up with that, a lot of the analogies you already have in the literature usually involve someone who pre-exists the improbable event. They have these stories of like someone going asleep and they're going to get woken up if someone rolls 2 dice. They're all really boring, prosaic examples in the Roger White paper. And when I was arguing on social media, almost everyone, again, including Tim Maudlin, said, well, that involves pre-selection. Like the person is pre-selected. They're sort of focused on themselves before the improbable event. Again, I'm never clear why that would make a theoretical difference, but that's why I came up with the Jane example where she doesn't, like in the fine-tuning case, she doesn't exist prior to the improbable event. So it just avoids that worry, I hope.
All right, so I think that might do it for us in terms of questions, unless I see another question come in through the live chat. I think we are actually at the end of the questions that people have sent in. So with that, I actually have, I think, one last question for you that I've been thinking about as I got your response to the previous question that I asked here's my question, is basically, with your view that God is limited in power yet perfectly good, or this is like just a hypothesis that you're sort of currently testing, right? I'm not saying that you actually subscribe to this theory.
Yeah, one of the views I'm open to, yeah.
One of the views that you're open to. So have you heard of the problem of fine-tuning of evil and suffering? Not the problem of fine-tuning, but the argument from the fine-tuning of evil and suffering.
I don't think I have, no.
There's a philosopher, it's not very well known. It only shows up, I think the only time that it shows up is in a book by Trent Doherty where he's talking about the problem of animal pain. And he's got this little section that's super interesting, and I just wanted to kind of get your thoughts on it. Basically, the idea is that just like there's a fine-tuning problem for the life-permitting universe that we experience, there's also a sort of fine-tuning problem of evil. And the way that works is that there could be a whole lot more suffering, there could be a whole lot less suffering. But the sort of range that we find ourselves in is a range of suffering that you've got to sort of find a hypothesis that explains that data. And on your view, your limited power view, do you think that you'd be able to explain that data very well, or do you think that it would have trouble coming up with, you know, a prediction of suffering in this particular range? Because suppose that God is limited in power, it could just be that he couldn't create a world that has this amount of suffering. Maybe the world would have a whole lot more suffering than it does, just constant suffering. Or it could be that he couldn't create a world that had any suffering at all. Could be that the only world that he could create would be, or she could be, a world that just, you know, is just a world of pleasure. So would that hypothesis, do you think that it would have trouble explaining that data?
Yeah, that's interesting. I'll have to think about that. I mean, as I say, I don't think the amount of suffering we have does fit well with omnitheism or perfect being theism. But in terms of my view, I think it would, because so presumably, so in my view, there's this, or one of the views I take seriously is the designer who's can only create from a singularity physics with a certain form. So they can't create something complex. That's the kind of idea. That seems kind of a fairly non-arbitrary constraint. You know, they couldn't just create intelligent life. So they have to create something from simplicity that's with the right laws that's going to evolve to more complex through natural selection. And so, it seems like and they think, so presumably if there was too much suffering, at some point they're going to say this isn't worth doing, right? But if they can bring about intelligent life with a lot of suffering, but with, you know, it's still worthwhile, there's not so much suffering that it no longer becomes worthwhile, then they're going to do it. So I'd have to think more about it, but I think that kind of does fit well with my hypothesis. And I think that's what the world looks like. It looks like, this is not ideal, but it's not really, really, really terrible. And it looks like there's some things that suggest it's better than we'd expect, much better than we'd expect, like the fine tuning. You'd expect there to be no life. So here's what Trent argues in favor of the view that perfect being theism explains the sort of range of suffering that we're currently sitting in. It's something that you and the audience will be familiar with is just a sort of standard soul building theodicy. So he's got a theodicy that he uses and says that the greatest goods are virtue, or the exemplification of virtues like forgiveness and courage and sacrifice. And in order to obtain those great goods, suffering is necessary and required to obtain those great goods. And he also argues that those are like the greatest goods. Okay, so that's an important step of the argument. So a God, a perfect being, is going to know what the greatest goods are, and so in order to obtain those greatest goods, he's going to have to allow the possibility of suffering. So that's the way that he sort of argues that perfect being theism is consistent with this range. But I still don't know that you're going to get, so, and obviously this is we'd have to like assume that this theodicy was like a good theodicy in order for this to be a good explanation or way to make the two sort of mesh well together. But maybe I could just ask, what are your thoughts on theodicies in general? Like, what do you think about the various theodicies that have been offered by theists to explain suffering? Yeah, brilliant. Well, so I've got a chapter on this as well that I've completed, and part of what I do, I talk a lot about skeptical theism. I think that's, you know, really most interesting response. But also I talk about Richard Swinburne's theodicy, which is, you know, really sophisticated, and so it's kind of similar to soul making, but it's based on, you know, that there's without natural evil, there's less opportunity. There wouldn't be much opportunity to show courage, to show compassion, to discover scientific truths. And so my thought in response to this is, I think, there are some goods that you wouldn't get in a more perfect reality, but the value of those goods is massively lessened, I think, if it turns out that the only reason we face those challenges is for the sake of the goods. So, I mean, the analogy I give, like, suppose I'm coming home from work and I see a burning building and there's a baby screaming, and I heroically climb up the building and climb on the roof and rescue the baby, and I get to the ground and everyone's cheering. And then a camera crew comes out and it turns out I'm on a game show, and they put the baby up there to give me the challenge. They'd put it in danger. I think like that massively lessens the value of what I've done. You know, I thought it was some heroic act, and no, it was just done to give me some challenge. And I sort of feel like that's kind of analogous to Richard Swinburne's world. The only reason we've got this suffering is to give us the challenge of being courageous. Or with the scientific case, suppose I discover the structure of DNA after 10 years hard work, and I'm like, wow, that's really amazing that I've discovered this. And then suddenly I see the words game over, and it turns out I'm in some future world where everything's perfect, and I've just set this up, put myself in a simulation to give myself the challenge of discovering some scientific truth because they've all been discovered. I think it massively lessens the value of that. So that's my response to Swinburne, which is kind of closely related to the soul making and skeptical theism. So what I say about, I just think on skeptical theism, I think, in any other case, we just have to assess the evidence as best we can. In any other Bayesian calculation, we just assess the evidence as best we can. And I think, so I want to say that the following moral proposition is true, that it would be immoral for an all-powerful being to create a universe like this. And I want to say, we've got very good reason to think that's true. In any way we can test it. And skeptical theists want to say, well, I can't really make that judgment. And I just think, like, why in this particular case can't I make that? Maybe there's all sorts of things that God knows about that I don't know. So maybe actually I'm wrong about that. But in any other case, you just do the best you can. And I think the best we can makes it look like that proposition is true. And I think that's, strong evidence against the omni-God.
Yes, on the topic of skeptical theism, I'm kind of on the fence about it. I used to be like all for it, and then I've read some of the works against it, and I'm kind of like, I don't know. I don't really buy the standard argument against skeptical theism that it just leads to too much skepticism. I don't know that that's the way to respond to skeptical theism, because the premises of skeptical theism just seem so intuitively true. And this also, like, there's different versions of skeptical theism. There is no the skeptical theism. It's just like we only have versions of it. And so we've got to specify exactly which one that we're currently looking at. But to go, I'm trying. Can you hear me? It looks like you may have cut in.
Am I back?
You're back. You're back.
Yeah, I cut out for a minute.
Okay.
Sorry.
So I'm trying to decide. We've got about 15 minutes left. But I don't know.
Could I give one more thought on skeptical theism? Oh, sorry.
Sure. Yeah, go ahead.
Just quickly, another analogy I give. So one of the analogies given in support of skeptical theism is if you're playing a grandmaster at chess and you're a beginner and you can't see the reason for the move they're making, so you think, oh well, there probably isn't a good reason, and the thought is that's an illegitimate inference, and then it's supposed to be, we should. Similarly, just because we can't see why God would do something, we shouldn't infer from that there's no reason, because God is so much cognitively more sophisticated than us. But I think the better analogy ought to be, you're playing chess online. You don't know if you're playing a grandmaster or just a bot that's making moves randomly, and the moves look pretty random. Then I think you should infer that you're playing a random bot rather than a grandmaster. So analogously, you look at the universe, it looks kind of like there's a lot of random, unnecessary suffering. You should make the analogous inference. Anyway, that's one of the things I try to press against.
Yeah. Are you familiar with
those specific analogies?
Are you familiar with John DePoe's version of skeptical theism? He's got a sort of positive skeptical theism. Eric Wielenberg has interacted with it. Eric Wielenberg thinks it's like the best version of skeptical theism that's out there, because it doesn't rule out natural theology. That's one of the sort of another standard response to skeptical theism, is it seems to be in conflict with natural theology. A lot of the arguments for the existence of God seem to rely on some kind of inference like that about the goods that we're aware of. But yeah, I just wanted to see if you were aware, or if you were
no, I'll look that up. I should definitely look that up.
Well, as you're researching the this part of your book, I think that might be. So another thing, I'll just bring up this point and then I'll close it out and I'll let you have the last word on it. Another thing that came up when we were talking about not skeptical theism, the soul building theodicy, and how you gave your analogy of the game show. Is that what it was? I thought that was a really good analogy. And what struck me when you were describing that was that it seems like it's almost describing a scenario, or it has a sort of theological assumption of something called meticulous providence, where God is sort of meticulously, providentially ordering the world in every specific way. But that's something, going back to that book, Trent Doherty rejects that view. So he would just say that, and I'm just going to set this up so you can give your response and then we'll close the show out. What he does is that he basically just sets up his view and says that God has got to allow for the possibility of suffering, but he's not like meticulously, providentially ordering the suffering to happen, because he rejects the doctrine of meticulous providence. And he's Catholic too, so I think that that's like a relatively rejectable view. I don't know if that's the right way to put that, but it's a view that you don't necessarily have to hold as a Catholic or as a Christian, just in general, that God is sort of meticulously. So what are your thoughts on, do you think that interacts with your point at all, or is it like completely irrelevant?
Yeah, that's interesting. I'll have to think more about that. Just off the cuff, I guess I'm not sure that was the relevant, capturing the kind of relevant analogy I was trying to get at there. The analogy was not so much about whether God's, planned every little detail. It was more, as I put it in the book, the kind of the artificiality of it. So yes, it is a great act of bravery to rescue a baby from a burning building, but the value of that is massively lessened when it's artificially set up to give you that challenge. And similarly, I think even if God's not meticulously planning everything, I'm just talking about Swinburne's theodicy here.
Yeah.
Theodicy stuff. Even though God's not meticulously planning everything, she set up the world in such a way as to have natural
such that
evil
it's possible
in order to give people in general challenges. And I still think that gives the kind of artificiality.
Okay, I'm going to leave it there. I think that we could have a really great discussion about this. That would be maybe something else or like, I don't know. There's so many different ways that we could go, but I still want to respect your time. I want to respect the fact that you've got something else going on here pretty quickly. So, but it was great to have you on. I really enjoyed this, and we've got to find, because you're not the topic that we discussed today, fine tuning and multiverse and stuff, like that's not really, I think your work is sort of overlapped on this, but it's not necessarily like your primary area of interest or like of research.
No, my primary work is on consciousness and
like I should have you back on to talk about that.
Yeah. That would be great. Yeah. My book, Galileo's Error, if anyone's interested, quick plug for that. But I just got interested in this really just, as I say, teaching philosophy of religion. And, like Tim Mulligan's great book, Purpose in the Universe, where he defends this God who doesn't care about us. And he said, and I had this experience as well, of also, teaching the fine tuning, then teaching the problem of evil, and finding I agree with both of these. You're supposed to go one way or the other, but I agree with both of these. And so that was my honest assessment. I think it's so kind of almost politicized and polarized that people feel I've got to choose one of them. But yeah, I could go for another 10 minutes or so if you wanted to, or if there was it. But if you the time.
Okay.
But, I'm happy. Well, whichever. I'm happy to finish as well. Whichever you.
Yeah, I think this might be a natural place to end the show, cool. And I would love to have you back on. We could just do a whole discussion on the problem of evil, because I think that's probably that would probably be the place where I'm trying to figure out the best way to put this. That a lot of the work is being done in your reasoning here. So like that's one of the things that's being used to argue against perfect being theism is this problem of evil. So it'd be good maybe one day to discuss theodicies more generally and just the value of those theodicies. To me, I think that what it ultimately comes down to is is sort of axiology. So like the value of the world that has suffering. So like if that world is more valuable, then a perfect being is obviously going to know that, and that's the world that they're going to create, is the world that is most valuable. So I don't know that it's like this situation where they're trying to set up some horrible scenario so that this can come about. I think it's more a question of which world is most valuable. That's the world that's most valuable. That's the world that's going to be created, as opposed to, it's not the sort of consequentialism doing this so that you can get this out of it. It's more has to do with axiology. I suppose that's ultimately the view that I would fall back on.
Yeah,
I'm
that's
happy to hear
interesting.
your thoughts on that.
And just to be fair, I guess I'm not, for this session, I haven't been too prepped about thinking of the problem of evil. So, maybe if we had another discussion, I'd be more in that mindset. I guess I was thinking fine tuning.
Yeah, I know. And that's my fault.
No, I'm not. That's fine. I'm happy to have the opportunity to talk about the some of my take on the problem of evil that I haven't really talked that much about, actually. So that's great. Just in terms of what you just said, yeah, I think that's right. I think I'd agree. It's about which world is most valuable, and I don't think I was thinking too consequentially in consequentialist terms about it. I mean, it's, I see the force of the point that having the opportunity to show great courage or scientific discovery is a great good. I was suggesting that was undermined if it's with this sort of artificiality. Is that thinking in consequentialist terms? I think part of, as Swinburne appreciates, and one of the very interesting things about his view is he appreciates we need to think not just about how good the world is, but about whether God has the right to use people in a sense
right.
to create a better world. So I think that would be an important part of why I think this world isn't, as I say, my starting way I spin the problem of evil. I actually agree that if you spin the problem of evil in the way William Rowe does, from like an inference to we can't think of any reason why suffering would be allowed, to there is no reason why suffering would be why God would allow suffering. So yeah, William Rowe sets it up as we can't see a reason why God would allow suffering, therefore there is no reason why God would allow suffering. I think actually skeptical theism is maybe a good response to that argument. But I would argue in a much more to that inference, sorry. I would argue in a much more direct way that I think we've got good reason to accept the following moral proposition. It would be immoral for a perfect being to create, I'll say again, it would be immoral for an all-powerful being to create a universe like this, because I think they could make a better one. And therefore, either the universe wasn't designed, or there's a not morally perfect creator. That would be the disjunction. And then, so yeah, I would just argue directly for that moral proposition. And I don't see that skeptical theists give me any reason to doubt my ability to assess that proposition. I might be wrong, I'm fallible, but you always just do the best you can.
This is why I think that my thinking lately has pulled me toward the view that it's really all about value and axiology, and like how good are these goods that we're talking about when we're discussing different theodicies like free will, like soul building. If they're really that good, then those are going to be some of the great making features of any possible world that God could create. And so if you can find a better good, then I think that would be ultimately where the conversation would be had. Or are these goods as good as theists are saying they are? Or is there some greater good, like pleasure? That's just an example. Is there a greater good that is more valuable than the good of the exemplification of virtues in the soul building case, or just the ability to self-determine your own character in the free will case? So I think ultimately it's just going to come down to axiology, a conversation about axiology ultimately.
Yeah. I suppose I think it would be better to have less suffering, to not have bodies that fall apart, to, why couldn't God just create a world where we just spend eternity contemplating her, the beatific vision, I suppose, at least a world with less suffering would be better. Yeah, I suppose I should have predicted this really, because I suppose if I went on an atheist podcast, we'd be more talking about getting pushed back on the fine tuning, but come on a Christian podcast, I suppose it's going to be, I should have predicted it would be the problem of evil. But anyway, it's been a really great discussion. It's
well, hey, look, you're the one that said I got another 10 minutes. So that's it.
That's absolutely
Yeah.
fine. That's absolutely fine.
No. I think we're pretty much in agreement then that it really comes down to a discussion of value. And so that's kind of where I've been focusing my thinking on, is like, what is more valuable? Is a world where, or just what's more valuable? Are these different theodicies that theists bring up, sort of free building, free will, soul building? Are these goods as good as theists are saying they are, or are there other goods like the ones that you mentioned, like the beatific vision, and I forget the other one that you mentioned, but are these greater goods? And I suppose I consistently fall back to the exemplification of virtues as being the highest goods. And so that's why ultimately I think that God would want to create a world. Because again, going back to axiology, God is going to create the world that is most valuable. And so if those are the most valuable things, or most valuable, great making features of a possible world, I think but ultimately that's contentious, right? I'm not saying that I'm just automatically correct here. I'm saying that that's where the disagreement, I think, between someone like you and someone like me would actually, like, that's the meat of it, would be in,
Absolutely.
but that's really difficult. Like, how do you, some of these goods seem incommensurable. It's like, how do you weigh the goodness of free will versus the beatific vision? Like, how do you, it gets really complicated, and like, almost, I don't know, like how to move forward from there. So that's kind of where I'm like almost at a stalemate at that point.
Yeah. I think we're on the same page with the how we should settle this at a general level. And I mean, I guess what we haven't touched on, also a big part of me, is animal suffering, and some of the horrific things we have in the natural world, but these creature weevils who paralyze their target, and then but they don't kill it. They spend days eating it and until it just dies from its wounds. I mean, just, I don't know. I mean,
and that's just one example, like the millions of years of suffering.
Yeah, couldn't there have been a world where we had this kind of challenges, soul-making challenges, that didn't have all that horrific suffering? And I mean, I don't know for sure. You get here William Lane Craig saying, you can't make that judgment. But I think, as I say, all we ever do with Bayesian reasoning is the best we can. We make the kind of best plausibility judgment we can. And I mean, this came up with Josh Rasmussen because, I mean, an important part of it for me, I think, is I don't see any reason or much reason to go for an all-powerful, to believe that the designer, if there is one, is all-powerful. I think I agree with Swinburne that there's a slight simplicity default position there, but I don't think that's much of a reason. So if I thought, the ontological argument worked, or, then, maybe it would be more of a pull. But I don't see there's any reason really to think the designer, if there is one, is all powerful. And looking at, the fact that we came into existence through this horrific process of survival of the fittest, it sort of looks, it doesn't look to me like and so I just think, look at the fine tuning, look at the suffering. I just think the most plausible view seems a God of limited powers, or one of these other options.
Well, I'm definitely in agreement that the problem of animal suffering is probably the most difficult challenge, I think, to theism. Even the specific challenge of animal suffering, as opposed to just some sort of like general problem of evil, which I think most people immediately gravitate toward, sort of moral evils that are done, or even natural evils that occur to people. So, but the specific problem of animal suffering, I think, is probably the biggest challenge to theism. And the responses to it are, I mean, they're very speculative. And I don't know. It's a really good problem. It's something that I've put a whole lot of thinking into as well. But in any case, we're right at the time that we said that we would go. So why don't I'll just close it out here. Well, let me give you the last a chance to give a last word or last comment or any other, going back to the actual topic of the interview, which was fine tuning in the multiverse. Are there any other thoughts that you have that you may have missed that you'd like to share now? Other than, and while you're thinking about that, let me just say that I've got his link to his Twitter, his website, and some other links, I think, in the description of this video. So if you guys are interested in learning more about Dr. Goff, go check out the description. There's even a description of who he is there as well. So anything and everything that you want to learn about Dr. Goff, just check for it in the description of this video. So do you have any other closing thoughts as we close out the episode?
Also the Mind Chat podcast, if I could plug that again. I don't know if that was in in case that's not in the,
I think it is.
In the notes. All right. Okay. Thank you. No, I think I've said everything. Yeah. So this is, I mean, the way I see things is just, I think it's so the Enlightenment ideal of just a dispassionate look of the evidence and see what it suggests. I think that's really hard to do. But I think I do believe a dispassionate look at the evidence suggests design or teleology or goal. The most neutral way I like to put it is goal-directed activity in the early universe from the fine-tuning. But also, I think as our moral consciousnesses, our moral understanding has developed, I think it looks less and less plausible, the omni-God. So I just kind of think, the unbiased look at the evidence would suggest something along the lines of a God of limited powers. But also, I mean, something that might be more sympathetic to viewers, I really think at some point the evidence of fine-tuning is going to cut through. As I say, I talk to people, they do not know about this unless they're really interested in, philosophy of religion or something, or science, or really into physics. But generally people don't know that. And people say, I say to people, there's these numbers in fundamental physics, and they're just needed to fall in a certain range for light to be possible. And people are really surprised at that. So I do think if this, I think this will cut through at some point and will radically change our culture. I just think people are naturally conservative, and it takes time for the culture to catch up with the evidence. People are still in the sort of 19th century Richard Dawkins mindset. But I think, I think that is changing. I think new atheism is a bit passé now. And I think, I think things are definitely going to change. I think the evidence always catches up in the end. People always catch up with the evidence in the end, I think.
Amen. I had to say that because you mentioned that this is a Christian channel, so I had to add a little Christian thing on the end of that. This is good. Yeah.
I'm happy to say amen.
Thanks again for coming on, Dr. Goff. This has been awesome. I should have asked you at the beginning of this if I could call you Philip or Phil. What do you go by?
Philip. Philip is usually, that's fine. I'm happy with Philip. Yeah. You can call me Phil if you want to, but the norm is Philip.
How about Dr. P?
Dr. P, I like that. Nobody calls me Dr. P. I'll be happy with that.
Dr. Pepper is what it reminds me of. Do you guys have Dr. Pepper over there?
Over there? Not really. We know of it because, Americanization of everything. But I don't think we actually sell it. Do we actually sell it in shops? I'm not sure.
Yeah, maybe not.
I'm not a fan of it
completely
myself.
Off topic too. Yeah, no worries. All right. Well, it's been a blast. I've learned a lot, and it's been a really cool conversation. So hopefully we can schedule something again. I know you're working on your book, so I want to be mindful of that as well. Mindful, get that. So there you go. Well, thank you guys for tuning in, and I will see you guys in the next Capturing Christianity video. See you guys.
Thanks
later.
So much, Cameron. It's been really good fun.
Yeah. Hey, it's me again. Actually, don't leave yet. I've got something super, super important to tell you. So first of all, you're awesome. Like you just watched a really, really long video just now, and you're still watching it. That is actually pretty amazing. Secondly, we have hundreds, literally hundreds of other apologetics related videos for you to watch on our channel. Go check them out. I've interviewed exorcists, hosted debates between Christians and atheists. I've even made response videos to atheists. All of that is available on our channel. Go check it out. Third, I rely on people that see value in my work, people like you that watch videos to the very end, to keep the lights on around here. Literally, this is how I feed my family.